It was a trade negotiation that should have been straightforward, but instead it became a costly political blunder that would cost Canada billions. The stakes couldn't have been higher. $25 billion in trade, millions of jobs, and the future of Canadian industries were on the line. However, the reality was that the fate of this trade deal wasn't decided by numbers or economic logic. It was decided by something far more unpredictable: the atmosphere in the room. Mark Carney's negotiating team entered the talks with a rigid approach that immediately put them at odds with the Trump administration. Their strategy was confrontational, a direct challenge to the U.S. administration style, which was notoriously aggressive and ego-driven. Carney's team, according to some reports, adopted what was described as an elbows-up approach, pushing back against the Trump administration rather than seeking a middle ground. This approach, though bold, played straight into Trump's hands, triggering a reaction that would have severe consequences for Canada. U.S. Ambassador Pete Hora, who was intimately involved in the negotiations, admitted the truth. It wasn't about trade deficits, numbers, or the hard data. It was about the energy in the room. The U.S., driven by Trump's personal need for dominance, responded with hostility to Canada's confrontational tactics. And the result was nothing short of catastrophic: the imposition of 35% tariffs on Canadian goods, particularly hitting the softwood lumber industry with devastating effect. Canada, instead of playing it smart and adapting to the dynamics of the room, dug in its heels. The entire negotiating posture was wrong. What was supposed to be a carefully measured discussion became a battle of egos, a standoff where Canada could not afford to lose face. In the end, they paid the price. The initial mistake wasn't economic mismanagement or the wrong policies. It was a failure to understand the personal dynamics of international diplomacy. In trade talks, as in life, the energy in the room matters, and that energy was toxic for Canada from the outset. The immediate aftermath of the 35% tariffs was nothing short of disastrous for Canada's economy. The government, industries, and everyday citizens were all left to pick up the pieces of a trade war that never had to happen. The softwood lumber industry, one of Canada's most important economic sectors, was hit hardest. This wasn't just a small blip in the economic radar. It was a catastrophe that reverberated through the economy and devastated communities. The 35% tariffs slapped on Canadian goods forced lumber producers to raise prices or absorb the enormous costs, both of which had massive ripple effects. For producers, especially in British Columbia, it meant a sudden halt in production, layoffs, and the shutdown of mills. Communities that depended on forestry as their backbone saw layoffs, fewer work shifts, and a growing sense of uncertainty. Small towns that relied on the stable wages of the lumber industry found themselves facing rising unemployment rates and declining living standards. The impact didn't stop at workers. Small businesses that supplied the lumber industry, from hardware stores to local contractors, began feeling the strain immediately. As the price of lumber skyrocketed due to tariffs, construction projects stalled, and the costs of building homes and infrastructure increased sharply. Families found themselves paying more for their homes and basic construction materials, squeezing their already strained budgets. The Canadian economy, already facing challenges, found itself on the brink of collapse due to a single, poorly executed decision at the negotiating table. In response, the Canadian government scrambled to save face, announcing over $1 billion in support for the softwood lumber industry. Loan guarantees were rolled out, and product development programs were introduced to keep businesses afloat. But these measures, while necessary, were little more than a band-aid on a much deeper wound. They could not undo the damage that had already been done. The industries that had once been stable were now crippled. The money, while helping some companies survive in the short term, did nothing to address the long-term vulnerability of Canada's economy. The government's desperate bailout only underscored the severity of the situation. It was a sign of Canada's desperation, of a government trying to prevent total economic collapse. But the damage to the credibility of Canada's trade strategy was irreparable. The political fallout was just beginning. Not only did Canadian businesses suffer, but the Canadian taxpayer was now footing the bill for a failure that could have been avoided. What's worse is that this was only the start. The ripple effects of these tariffs would be felt for years to come. The economy would take years to recover, and the industries that had once been strong pillars of Canada's trade relationships were now severely weakened. In just a few short months, Mark Carney's negotiation team had turned what should have been a win for Canada into a financial catastrophe. As Canada spiraled into an economic crisis, there was another country watching closely: Mexico. And while Canada was reeling from the fallout of its confrontational trade stance, Mexico's negotiators were quietly securing a far better deal. It's not that Mexico had a stronger economy or better policies. They simply understood one fundamental truth that Canada had overlooked: how to manage the human element in negotiations. While Carney and his team were engaged in a high-stakes power struggle with the Trump administration, Mexico played a more subtle, low-key game. They understood the critical importance of managing the mood in the room. Rather than escalate tensions, Mexico's diplomats adopted a pragmatic approach that kept things calm, focused, and far less confrontational. They avoided public fights and carefully kept out of the media spotlight. Their strategy was to work quietly behind the scenes, where they could make headway without challenging the ego of the Trump administration. The stark contrast between Canada's approach and Mexico's strategy became painfully clear when the Trump administration granted Mexico a 90-day reprieve, delaying the imposition of new tariffs. This was not due to Mexico's superior trade policies or stronger leverage. It was a direct result of Mexico's ability to avoid confrontation, respect Trump's need for dominance, and play the game on his terms without provoking him. Mexico understood the art of negotiation, knowing when to push and when to pull back. In contrast, Canada, under Carney's leadership, refused to back down. The Canadian team's decision to double down on their rigid positions, even in the face of rising tensions, gave Trump exactly what he wanted: a fight. By pushing back aggressively, Canada only fueled Trump's desire to prove his strength. In this game of egos, the Canadians misread the room and inadvertently gave Trump the leverage he craved. The tariffs were a direct result of this failure to understand the dynamics of power at the negotiation table. What's worse, the damage done to Canada's negotiating position was not limited to the softwood lumber industry. Other sectors, too, found themselves vulnerable to punitive measures due to Canada's inability to engage diplomatically. While Mexico quietly steered clear of these same pitfalls, Canada's industry leaders were left scrambling to deal with the fallout of unnecessary provocations. Mexico's strategy wasn't about having a stronger economy. It was about understanding the psychology of the room. Their negotiators knew when to retreat, when to soften their stance, and when to bide their time. And it worked. Mexico managed to avoid the worst of the economic fallout that hit Canada so hard. In contrast, Canada's negotiating team made fatal errors in judgment, and the cost would be borne by Canadian businesses, workers, and taxpayers alike. The lesson here is clear: negotiation is not just about policies, numbers, or economic leverage. It's about reading the room, understanding the human element, and knowing how to engage in a way that de-escalates rather than escalates. Canada, by not adapting, made a fundamental error in judgment, while Mexico's quiet diplomacy provided them with a safer and more favorable position. The political fallout from Canada's failed trade negotiation strategy went far beyond the economic losses incurred by industries and taxpayers. The imposition of the 35% tariffs was not just an economic disaster, it was a devastating blow to Canada's credibility on the global stage. And the consequences were not limited to trade relations. They reverberated through Canada's political landscape, highlighting a deep-seated issue in the country's diplomatic approach. When Canada's negotiating team failed to adapt, they not only alienated the Trump administration, but also lost face in front of the international community. Political leaders across the world were watching closely, and they saw a country that was too rigid, too focused on pushing an ideological agenda, rather than navigating the shifting dynamics of global diplomacy. This lack of adaptability made Canada appear weak and uninformed, leaving the door wide open for other nations to take advantage of its vulnerability. The failure to engage with Trump's administration in a more flexible and pragmatic way left Canada at a severe disadvantage. As former Foreign Minister Peter MacKay pointed out, Carney's elbows-up strategy was destined to backfire. It was the wrong approach for dealing with a leader like Trump, who thrived on confrontation and was hell-bent on making himself the center of attention. Trump's need for dominance made any challenge to his authority a personal affront, and Canada, by refusing to back down, escalated tensions rather than resolving them. In the long term, Canada's inability to read the room cost it dearly. The political capital that could have been used to negotiate a fair deal was squandered in the battle of egos. Instead of finding areas of common ground, Carney's team dug in their heels, making the negotiations about who could win the most rather than how to reach a solution. This mindset failed to recognize the changing nature of global diplomacy in international relations, where personal dynamics and strategic flexibility play just as much of a role as hard economic data. Moreover, Canada's failure to navigate the situation with diplomacy left a scar on its relationships with other international partners. Allies and adversaries alike watched as Canada struggled in the face of a negotiation that was defined not by policy, but by personal vendettas. The damage to Canada's credibility would have lasting effects on future trade discussions, as countries began to question whether Canada was capable of protecting its interests in an increasingly volatile world. The fallout from this diplomatic blunder wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Industries suffered, workers lost jobs, and entire communities were torn apart. The political leaders who failed to anticipate these consequences, who failed to understand that diplomacy is as much about reading people as it is about policies, must shoulder the blame. The impact of their decisions would echo through Canada's trade negotiations for years to come. At its core, Canada's diplomatic rigidity was a failure of leadership. It revealed a political class that was out of touch with the realities of modern negotiations and unprepared to deal with the unpredictability of a world dominated by ego-driven leaders like Donald Trump. Instead of responding with adaptability, Canada responded with pride, an expensive mistake that cost the country billions and left it politically exposed. The lesson from this debacle is clear. Political flexibility and emotional intelligence are just as important as economic policy when it comes to international negotiations. Canada's leadership failed to understand this, and the repercussions are still being felt today. As the dust settles from Canada's disastrous trade negotiations with the Trump administration, the most crucial question remains: what happens next? The damage has been done, the costs are mounting, and Canadian industries, workers, and taxpayers are left to deal with the aftermath. But this is not just a story of a trade failure. It is a clear warning of what happens when a nation fails to adapt, when it refuses to prioritize pragmatic solutions over pride and ideology. The real cost of this trade war isn't just the billions in tariffs or the bailout measures that followed. It's the fundamental lesson that Canada must learn. Adaptability is key in international relations. The failure to read the room, the refusal to adjust tactics, and the obsession with rigid policies all contributed to Canada's defeat at the negotiating table. And the consequences were far-reaching, affecting everything from industry stability to political credibility. Canada cannot afford to continue down this path of inflexibility. The world is shifting, and trade negotiations are becoming more complex and unpredictable. Leaders who refuse to understand the personalities at play, the emotions involved, and the nuances of each situation will find themselves on the losing end, just as Canada did. It is time for Canada's political class to take a hard look in the mirror and reassess its approach. The days of rigid, ego-driven negotiations must be over. What Canada needs is leadership that can balance hard-nosed economic strategy with a deep understanding of human dynamics. Negotiators must learn when to hold firm and when to back off. The next time Canada finds itself at the negotiating table, it must do so with the wisdom to adapt to changing circumstances, to recognize when it is time to compromise, and to use emotional intelligence to win the room. The call for change is not just about adopting better trade policies. It is about overhauling Canada's entire approach to diplomacy. Leaders must prioritize long-term strategy over short-term pride. And it's time for Canadians to demand leadership that is capable of protecting their interests, that can navigate complex international relations with both strength and flexibility. In the end, Canada's political future depends on its ability to learn from these mistakes and adapt to the challenges of a changing world. If the country is to avoid another catastrophic failure, it must embrace the lessons of this trade war. A new era of diplomatic adaptability is needed, one where personality and strategy are balanced to ensure success rather than ego-driven conflict that undermines the national interest. The damage has been done, but there is still time to change course. Canada's leaders must step up, embrace a new strategy, and leave behind the failed tactics of the past. Now more than ever, Canada needs negotiators who can adapt to the unpredictable and emotionally charged world of international diplomacy. The question is, will the political class rise to the occasion, or will the country continue to pay the price for its failures? The time to demand better leadership is now. The time for change is now. Canadians must hold their leaders accountable for what happened and push for a diplomatic strategy that will protect their future. If not, the price for failure will be far higher the next time.